Right, we're back for the second part of lecture part B, vitamin C. The classic deficiency disease. I'll come back to this a bit later on in a later lecture. I've got a lecture called Guinea Pigs, Humans and Carrots, which we will have a more detailed look at vitamin C and why we don't synthesize our own vitamin C. Historically, it was often seen in sailors embarking on long voyages with limited supplies of fresh fruit and vegetables, leading to the well-known conditions: teeth falling out, hair falling out, and the general scurvy dog appearance. Land scurvy was also a problem historically. The symptoms were similar to sea scurvy, if less severe. They were associated with long winters, again with limited fruit and other sources of vitamin C in the diet. Until the 18th century, most people believed that land scurvy and sea scurvy were different diseases. This may have been because at sea, symptoms appeared more suddenly and were usually more severe. This is probably because once the ship's fresh provisions were exhausted, the diet had little or no vitamin C. But it is, of course, the same disease. It is lack of vitamin C in the diet. This is from the book The Englishman's Food, also The English Woman and the English Child's Food. It was written in the 1950s, so don't beat me up over the title. Jack Drummond's famous book. Jack Drummond was a well-known British nutritionist, and this was the 15th century peasant's diet. Now, you probably don't want an ounces. It's 28 grams. A pound is about 450 grams, and a pint is about just over half a litre. It talks about maslin bread, which was made from a mixture of rye and wheat flour. After a poor harvest, when grain was in short supply, people were forced to include beans, peas, and even acorns in their bread, which probably wasn't a bad thing, apart from maybe the acorns. Peas, sometimes known as peas pudding or peas pottage, is a baked vegetable product which consists of split yellow or carlin peas, water, salt, and spices, often cooked with a bacon or ham joint. This diet is equivalent to about 3,000 calories a day, and the notice it says 300, but it's 3,000 calories a day, which is more than modern recommendations, but may well have been too low for a medieval peasant diet. If you're interested in the history of English food, Drummond's diet is well worth tracking down. Drummond's book, rather, is well worth tracking down. So this is Jack Drummond. We'll pause for a moment for a word about the author of An Englishman's Food, one of the giants of British nutrition. Perhaps his greatest achievement came in 1940, in February, when he was appointed scientific advisor at the Ministry of Food. He produced a plan for rationing of food based on sound nutritional principles. Thanks to this plan, the poorest people in the UK gained more proteins and vitamins, while the richest had to cut their consumption, at least in principle. Studies after the war demonstrate that despite the hardships endured, the population's health had improved. There are some people who say this was probably the best diet in the history of the UK. And again, you can read more about Drummond there. After the war, Drummond was appointed as chief chemist at Boots the Chemist in August 1952, not 1852. My notes are a bit random here, it seems. He and his family were on a camping holiday in France. They parked by the roadside to spend the night under canvas, and sadly, the next morning their bodies were found, all three having been brutally murdered. Suspicion soon fell on the local Dominici family. Ultimately, the patriarch of the family, 75-year-old Gaston, who used a walking stick, was convicted of the brutal murders and sentenced to death. He stayed on death row for 3 years before the sentence was reduced to life imprisonment, and he was released in 1960 on health grounds. And the case remains hugely controversial in France to this day. The arguments are that Dominici Gaston wasn't the killer, but it certainly was one of his family. And if you're interested, this video from Pathé News has a little bit about the trial, and it's quite an evocative video, evocative of the time. Okay, so back to the Middle Ages, where things improved land scurvy wise in the spring. Again, there's a quote there from Drummond. Folk remedies included purslane and eclampane, which were known for making the teeth firm and purifying the blood in springtime, basically because it contained vitamin C. Common purslane is an annual succulent. Eclampane, also called horseheal, is a perennial composite plant common in many parts of Great Britain and ranges throughout Central and Southern Europe, and in Asia as far east as the Himalayas, and again is quite high in vitamin C. More Drummond. Potable water, let's say drinkable water, was hard to find before modern sanitation, especially in rapidly growing towns and cities. Most people in Britain and much of Europe obtain their water from beer. Now, this is a much weaker form than usual these days, typically around 1% alcohol, which was enough to make it safe to drink. This is in contrast to countries like China and Japan, where water was made safe by boiling to make tea. Moving on. We've done a number of projects on increasing the vitamin C concentration in plants like scurvy grass grown hydroponically. This is done by adding sodium chloride to the nutrient solution. Sodium ion is an oxidant, and the plant produces more vitamin C, which is an antioxidant, which I'll talk about more later on, and it provides protection for the plant. What we found was in the control there was a certain amount of vitamin C. There's 3 bars here for 3 different samples. As we increased the concentration, we had quite a lot more vitamin C, and this continued in varying amounts. It seemed to spike and then tail off towards the end as we increased the concentration. So some interesting effects observed, demonstrating the fact that we can manipulate the nutrition concentration of plants by manipulating the nutrients which they consume. Okay, well-known tea cider. Captain James Cook is often credited with good on-board practices in the prevention of scurvy. During his Pacific voyages, Cook was supplied with 40 bushels of malt, 100 pounds of portable soup, vinegar, mustard, wheat, together with proper quantities of sauerkraut and rob. Now, rob is a form of concentrated vitamin of lemon juice made by evaporating it over a fire until it achieves the consistency of a syrup. Unfortunately, this probably destroys the vitamin C. However, the sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, will contain quite a lot of vitamin C. 5 of his crew did come down with scurvy, but none fatally. The real lasting contribution to our understanding of prevention of scurvy came to work from another British naval person, ship surgeon William Lind. In 1753, he published a treatise on the scurvy, containing inquiry into nature, causes, cure and cure of that disease. And the title went on for a while, as the titles went on in those days, largely ignored at the time, possibly due to his confused or unscientific arguments, but he ultimately knew what he was talking about. So this is what he did. So James Lind, go back a slide. Oops. Yeah, so Lind, just make sure I know where I am. Okay, so Lind demonstrated how eating oranges and lemons could prevent scurvy. He did this by using one of the first controlled experiments in nutritional science. Now, Lind, of course, knew nothing about vitamin C, but his empirical results were compelling. Empirical is results from experimentation. This was one of the first scientific studies of a deficiency disease. So groups of sailors showing symptoms of scurvy were given different treatments over a period of 2 weeks, which are there. Some of them got cider, some of them got elixir of vitriol, that is dilute sulfuric acid. Some of them got oranges and lemons. Now, vinegar and oil of vitriol, as you might expect, had no effect. Cider had a small effect, presumably because of some residual vitamin C from the apples, but oranges and lemons were highly successful in clearing up the condition, which led to changes. Eventually, it took a long while, but eventually the Admiralty came around to Lind's views and decreed that all sailors should consume lime juice daily. Until quite recently, Americans often referred to the British, and especially sailors, as limeys for this reason. So the Royal Navy effectively abolished scurvy. Problems continued in the Merchant Navy almost up to the start of the First World War in 1914. So how much is enough? It's interesting, the average British diet, potatoes have historically been the biggest source of vitamin C. They contain less than fruits, but historically we've eaten a lot of them. Muscle meats and cereals do not contain significant amounts of vitamin C. An average orange or kiwi food contains about 50 milligrams, and you will probably need 2 to 3 average potatoes to get the idea, which people often used to eat. I think people eat less potatoes these days. So this is sadly typical of advertising you see for so-called superfoods. There's goji the squirrel monkey. If you like goji berries for their taste, fine. But since vitamin C is water soluble, it can't be stored. is excreted in the urine. So the extra vitamin C is not particularly relevant nutritionally. Pip, the squirrel monkey, has a brain about the size of a couple of goji berries, so at least he has an excuse. So this thing here showing vast amounts of vitamin C in goji berries is essentially irrelevant. Gone but not forgotten, vitamin C deficiency is rare but not completely unknown. When it's found, it's often found in chronic alcoholics. One issue, as is mentioned in this particular paper here, is that symptoms have rarely been seen by doctors these days. Okay, that's the end of part B.